Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the gritty, foul, and oddly fascinating world of medieval labor, a time when your job title wasn't about passion or career growth, but about your chances of catching the plague or setting yourself on fire. Before we begin, make sure you're settled in, give the video a like if you enjoy what I do, and subscribe for more dark dives into history's less glamorous corners. Drop a comment too. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that medieval ambiance, and let's descend together into the night. Imagine you're born in medieval England, not noble or scholarly, just average. You don't want to be a knight, too bloody. You don't want to be a monk, too quiet. So you pick the easiest path and become a gong farmer. Gong wasn't a bell or musical instrument, it was slang for human waste. Yes, your noble task was to dig out the contents of medieval latrines, cesspits, and privies after people enjoyed their feast of turnips and regret. You worked at night, not because it was mysterious, but because the stench was so unbearable that people didn't want to be reminded you existed. Armed with a shovel, a bucket, and what was left of your dignity, you'd descend waist-deep, or worse, into the muck. The pay was surprisingly good, sometimes even better than carpenters or roofers, but you earned every coin while standing in humanity's darkest depths. Death by cesspit collapse or methane fumes wasn't uncommon, making it one of history's most disgusting yet essential jobs. But perhaps you crave something more natural. You want open air and wildlife. Congratulations, you're now a leech collector. Your job? Stand in a bog, bare-legged, and let leeches attach themselves to your skin. You were the bait. Once the bloodsuckers latched on, you'd peel them off and drop them into a jar. Repeat until you felt faint from blood loss. Leeches were a cornerstone of medieval medicine, used for everything from headaches to heartbreaks, because the cure for all ills, apparently, was less blood. Collectors were often poor women, standing barefoot in filthy, bacteria-filled ponds. If you were lucky, you just went home itchy. If not, you went home infected, dizzy, and partially drained. Still, it was honest work. No one would rob you, at least. No thief wanted to wrestle someone covered in leeches. If that sounds bad, brace yourself. You could have been a plague barrier. When the Black Death swept through in the 14th century, bodies piled up faster than anyone could count. Someone had to dig the mass graves, haul corpses, and shovel disease into the earth. Protective gear was primitive. A rag soaked in vinegar or a clove of garlic tied around your neck. Entire neighborhoods died overnight, and you were the one making sure cities didn't drown in their own dead. You were feared, shunned, and underpaid, but without you, civilization might have collapsed entirely. Many barriers ended up buried themselves, victims of the same plague they fought against. If you managed to survive that, maybe you turned to fulling, a cleaner trade in theory, but not in smell. As a fuller, you softened wool by stomping it in tubs of stale human urine. Ammonia in the pea cleaned and softened the fibers, but that meant hours a day of foot stomping in reeking liquid. The fumes were unbearable, so fulling houses were built far from town. Between ammonia burns, fungal infections, and rashes, your feet were constantly at war with your job. Still, someone had to make the medieval world's itchy wool tunics wearable, and that someone was you. Or perhaps you preferred something mechanical. Enter the treadwheel operator, a human engine inside a massive wooden hamster wheel. Your job was to walk endlessly, lifting heavy stones high into cathedral walls using nothing but your legs in despair. You worked suspended 40 feet in the air, balancing life and gravity with every step. One misstep, and it was game over. The pay? Barely enough to survive, but hey, at least you weren't stomping wool and pea anymore. Progress, right? And finally, for those who liked their work fast, furious, and flea-bitten, there was the rat catcher. You were the brave or foolish soul crawling under taverns and castles, chasing plague-carrying rats through filth and darkness. Your gear consisted of a torch, a sack, a stick, and perhaps a terrier if you were lucky. Every bite, every scratch was a potential death sentence. But the job had to be done. After all, someone had to keep medieval cities from being completely overrun by rodents. So, whether you were knee-deep in filth, waist-deep in corpses, or ankle-deep in urine, one thing's certain: medieval labor was not for the faint of heart. These workers might not have worn crowns or wielded swords, but they kept their world from collapsing. One shovel, one step, and one rat at a time.
Après-coup. Let's talk about pay, because
Let's be honest, no one was getting rich chasing rats. Most rat catchers earned a few coins per tail, which meant proof of your daily victories came in the form of grim little trophies, a medieval loyalty program with no perks. Occasionally, towns hired you during outbreaks when the smell of death became too obvious to ignore, but as soon as the panic faded, so did your paycheck and your social status. People wouldn't sit near you, talk to you, or ask about your day, but deep down, everyone was grateful you existed. Without you, the rats would have inherited the earth, or at least the pantry. Maybe you decide to switch things up and work indoors, perhaps around nobility and children. Sounds wholesome, right? Think again. You've just become a whipping boy, a living punishment proxy for a royal brat. Whenever the young prince misbehaved, you were the one flogged for his crimes. Since royal children were considered too divine to be physically punished, you took the lashes while he watched. Idea. Lie learning empathy, but more often just enjoying the show. You shadowed the prince everywhere: lessons, meals, writing practice. If he failed Latin, you got the rod. If he threw a tantrum, you got a limp. There was no promotion, no senior whipping boy title, just the faint hope that your tormentor might grow up and remember your friendship. Some did, many didn't. Payment came in room, board, and maybe a thank you between bruises. No statues were built in your honor, but you did get to eat from the prince's table before being beaten for his food fight. Let's say you crave peace, solitude, and maybe fewer children swinging swords near your head. You become a lime burner, a man whose lungs sound like dying bellows. Your task: burn limestone in roaring kilns to make quicklime used in mortar, plaster, and occasionally corpse disposal. You spent days beside a blazing oven, shoveling rock and fuel while inhaling toxic dust that turned your insides into chalk. Sweat was dangerous. Quickly. Me reacts violently with water, meaning your own perspiration could set your skin on fire. Protective gear, a rag for your mouth if you were fancy. Your smell was part scorched earth, part despair, and people avoided you like an omen. But you built the bones of cities, even if your own were dissolving one breath at a time. Maybe, just maybe, you'd prefer nighttime work, quiet and unsupervised. Enter the resurrectionist, a professional grave robber with a moral compass permanently set for science. When medical schools began needing human bodies for study, the church said no, so you said yes. You and a partner would sneak into cemeteries, dig up freshly buried corpses, and sell them to anatomists under cover of darkness. No gold teeth, no jewelry, just the body itself, delivered within 48 hours of burial before things got too soft. It wasn't theft, you tell yourself. It was scientific recycling. Of course, families and priests disagreed, and grave traps became common: iron cages, bee holders, even explosives. Payment, though, was excellent. More than a peasant's monthly wage for one decent corpse. Morally questionable? Definitely. Profitable? Absolutely. Then there's perhaps the strangest position in all of courtly history: the groom of the stool. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Your royal duty was to assist the king during his most private of moments, ensuring his velvet-lined golden toilet was ready, wiping him afterward, and maintaining the royal dignity from behind. It was both disgusting and prestigious. The groom was often a nobleman, trusted more than most courtiers, because when you've literally seen the king's most vulnerable side, you've earned some influence. You handled his personal correspondence, advised him, and controlled who could approach him, making you a political gatekeeper disguised as a bathroom attendant. It paid handsomely, but bragging rights were limited. I keep the king comfortable didn't exactly dazzle at banquets. Ebergy now, if Roya. Bathrooms sound too intimate, perhaps the kitchen calls. Becoming a medieval cook wasn't about fine dining. It was about keeping your lord's dinner from becoming a biohazard. You worked with ingredients that were mostly fresh and spices meant to hide the taste of rot. Recipes read like vague prayers: boil the meat, add herbs, hope. Feasts were chaos. Hundreds of dishes, roaring fires, dripping ceilings, dogs underfoot, and one unlucky scullery boy who always vanished mid-shift. You sculpted saints and dragons out of pastry, boiled endless stews, and prayed no one died from undercooked pigeon pie. If you survived the night without poisoning a noble, congratulations, you kept your job. Then there was the quarryman, humanity's eternal arm wrestler with stone. Your day began before sunrise, hammering wedges into unyielding rock until your muscles begged for mercy. Dust filled your lungs, flakes hit your eyes, and the noise erased your hearing, one clang at a time. Cave-ins were common F. Atalism was mandatory, and your pay was barely enough to dull the ache in your spine. Still, your stones built cathedrals, castles, and prisons, a strange kind of immortality carved in pain and granite. Perhaps you prefer a little more adventure. Then try being a wartime messenger. You were the medieval USB stick, carrying vital military orders across hostile lands, praying not to get skewered by either side. Speed was life. You rode through storms, mud, and enemy lines with secret scrolls that could decide wars. If caught, you were tortured. If mistaken for a spy, you were hanged. Pay was decent, survival odds were not. But your work connected armies and kings, the unsung courier of chaos. And finally, there was the blacksmith, the town's blazing heart and hammer. You forged everything from swords to nails, working in heat so intense your sweat could boil. Burns, deafness, and exhaustion were constants, but so was respect. Without you, civilization's tools crumbled. You were the original. Engineer, the fixer of worlds, though you never got statues, just more broken metal and customers asking for discounts. To close our grim tour, meet the bard, the wandering performer, poet, and public relations agent of the Middle Ages. You sang of heroes, battles, and heartbreak, charming taverns and courts alike. Your life was romantic in theory, miserable in practice. Cold nights, hungry days, and the constant risk of insulting the wrong noble with one badly timed rhyme. Yet bards held real power. They shaped history, carried news, and gave the people their stories. You weren't rich or clean, but your songs outlived kings. Together, these jobs paint a vivid picture of medieval life. Filthy, perilous, absurdly underpaid, but absolutely vital. Every gong farmer, lime burner, and rat catcher kept the world turning, even if it stank while doing so. It began with whispers of sails shaped like dragon wings, of warriors with iron beards and eyes as cold as frozen seas. The Seine had always been Paris's lifeline, wide, serene, and proud. But in the spring of 845, the river turned into a warning. One by one, the Frankish towns along its banks went silent. No bells, no smoke from hearths, only drifting wreckage and blood carried by the current. When word reached Paris, the question wasn't if the Norsemen were coming, but when, and how terrible it would be this time. Yet this wasn't just another raid by wandering sea wolves hungry for gold and livestock. This was Ragnar Lodbrok, the storm made flesh. To the Franks, his name cracked like thunder through cathedral roofs. Ragnar, the man who claimed descent from Odin himself. Ragnar, whose sons would later carve their legends into Europe's bones. Ragnar, who now approached Paris with 120 longships and more than 5,000 hardened warriors. He didn't sneak toward the city, he announced himself. His black sails blotted out the sky, his oars beat the river like war drums, and every monastery or village along the Seine was left in ashes. Ibrahim, King Charles the Bald, scrambled to assemble defenses, but his realm was bleeding from civil wars and noble feuds. The church cried for divine help, while the nobles argued over which bridge to guard. Meanwhile, Ragnar's fleet kept advancing, an unstoppable tide of wood, steel, and fury. Parisians watched from half-built walls as the horizon darkened with death. Mothers hid their children in cellars. Priests clutched relics with trembling hands. Messengers galloped between towns begging for reinforcements that would never come. The Norsemen were no longer tavern myths. They were real, and they were here. Ragnar's longships glided up the Seine like serpents, their prows carved into beasts with painted eyes meant to ward off evil. But this time, the evil was already on board. These weren't ragtag fishermen chasing fortune, they were professional killers forged in the fires of England, Ireland, and the North Sea. Each ship was a floating war machine lined with painted shields, its cray. Decorated with braids, scars, and stolen Frankish mail. Some warriors were bare-chested and smeared with ash, others tattooed with symbols of death. Every village they passed became a rehearsal for the main act. Paris itself. Churches were torched, monks dragged in chains, soldiers skewered and tossed into the river. If a village was lucky, it was only robbed. If not, it was erased. Ragnar left survivors not out of mercy but strategy. He wanted panic to spread ahead of him, to let Paris choke on fear before he arrived. By the time Ragnar's fleet reached the gates of Paris, the city was already trembling. The capital, weakened by famine, plague, and civil unrest, was utterly unprepared for what came next. Paris in 845 was not the fortress we imagine today. It was a modest city huddled on an island, the Ile de la Cité, guarded by 2 wooden bridges and makeshift walls. Its defenders were local militias, priests with swords, and nobles more skilled at feasting than fighting. To Ragnar, it looked less like a challenge and more like a feast. Aber the Vikings wasted no time. Ragnar ordered probing attacks on the outskirts, testing the city's defenses, and what he found was pitiful. The Frankish response was chaotic and terrified. Ragnar's men soon surrounded the island from both banks, cutting off all movement on the river. No boats in, no food out. The siege began. The Norse set up campfires all along the banks, drinking mead, rolling dice, and sharpening their axes just within earshot of the city walls. Paris rang its bells and prayed, but every toll sounded like a funeral knell. A desperate sortie across one of the bridges ended in disaster when Ragnar's men faked retreat, lured the Franks into open ground, and slaughtered them. To drive his point home, Ragnar crucified the captured soldiers along the riverbank, grim silhouettes against the smoke, mocking the faith of the city he besieged. Aber. Inside Paris, famine crept through the streets. Food ran low, disease spread, and morale hattered. King Charles the Bald had already fled to safety, leaving his capital to rot. Ragnar, calm as ever, sat by his fire watching the smoke curl upward, sharpening his axe, smiling as his masterpiece unfolded. Meanwhile, far from the carnage, Charles was unraveling. The Carolingian heir of Charlemagne was being humiliated by a pagan pirate with fire in his veins. His nobles refused to help, too busy guarding their own lands, and his treasury was nearly empty. Paying off Vikings was shameful, but starvation and rebellion were worse. So he sent envoys to bargain, offering gold, supplies, even titles if Ragnar would just leave. Ragnar refused. He didn't want promises. He wanted Paris to bleed. Desperate, Charles scraped together one last army. A patchwork of peasants, local counts, and mercenaries promised a handful of silver for their loyalty. Their mission, break the siege, but Ragnar learned of their plans and ambushed them before they could reach the city. The result was a massacre. Survivors were hanged or shot full of arrows. When the news reached Charles, his last hopes crumbled. There would be no victory, no redemption, only payment. And so pride gave way to pragmatism. Charles swallowed his humiliation and offered Ragnar a ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver, over 2 tons of treasure, enough to bankrupt a kingdom. Ragnar's envoys listened, smiled, and accepted. The Franks hauled chest after chest of silver to the Viking ships in silence while the Norsemen drank, sang, and laughed. Some debated taking the money and sacking the city, but Ragnar restrained them. He didn't need to burn Paris to the ground to prove he could. Accepting the ransom sent a clearer message: I own your fear. When the silver was loaded, Ragnar raised his sails and turned his ships downstream. Not as a defeated invader, but as a victorious conqueror departing on his own terms. Behind him, Paris smoldered. Not destroyed, but humiliated. Some say his ships were so heavy with silver that he threw into the Seine to stay afloat. Others claim he left crucified prisoners along the banks as a farewell gift. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable. Ragnar Lodbrok had just robbed one of Christendom's mightiest kings and sailed away untouched. As the dragon-headed ships vanished over the horizon, the Seine grew silent again. Paris didn't cheer, it exhaled. A long, broken sigh of survival. The siege was over, but the trauma would linger for generations. The bridges were blackened, the churches desecrated, the streets littered with the bones of defiance. The age of the Viking was no longer coming. It had arrived, and it began with Ragnar's laughter echoing over the water, fading into legend. Though the walls of Paris still technically stood, the illusion of safety had been burned to ash. From the cellars and crypts, hollow-eyed survivors emerged, half expecting the Norse to return and finish what they'd started. Hope did not come back first. Blame did. The clergy accused the king of cowardice. The nobles accused each other of apathy, and the common people cursed them all. Hanging over it all was the bitter truth. Charles the Bald had bought off the invaders and abandoned his capital to rot. There was no disguising it as diplomacy or tactical retreat. It was panic, paid in silver. The church tried to spin survival as divine mercy, a test of faith perhaps, but everyone knew better. It wasn't angels that spared Paris. It was money. Ebru the ransom gutted the royal treasury, inflation soared, taxes strangled the countryside, and monasteries mourned their looted relics. After years of famine and civil war, the Frankish realm buckled further under the weight of humiliation. Meanwhile, Ragnar Lothbrok's legend only grew, his fame rising as fast as the Carolingian crown fell. Militarily, the blow was devastating. Ragnar had revealed the soft underbelly of the Frankish defense. He needed no siege engines, just a river and a reason. Other Norse warlords took note. If mighty Paris sea would be shaken, what else lay ripe for plunder? It was clear this was no ending, but a beginning, a grim prelude of raids yet to come. Songs and sagas spread his legend. Some said he died laughing in a pit of snakes. Others that he lived to watch his sons ravage Europe in his honor. Whatever the truth, the myth endured. Ragnar the cunning, Ragnar the relentless, Ragnar the model of Norse power. He had shown how one man could break a kingdom's pride and sail away a legend. His siege became a template for Viking dominance, and Paris would never be the same. Pride. The memory of 845 scarred the city's soul. It was carved into its stones, its prayers, and the nightmares of its priests. The monarchy rebuilt in paranoia, fortifying walls, patrolling rivers, and reforming its armies. These painful lessons would one day give rise to the Capetian dynasty and a stronger France, but the trauma lingered. To Parisians, Ragnar became a name whispered to frightened children. Merchants, monks, and mothers alike remembered the screams, the smoke, and the silence that followed. Every foreign sail on the horizon rekindled old fear. They've come. Again. Abru yet from bloodshed came transformation. Viking mercenaries began to serve Frankish kings. Norse settlers became Christian lords. The raiders who once besieged Paris would, in time, defend it. Ironically, the invaders helped forge the very kingdom they once humbled. Still, something deep within the city's heart had changed forever. The siege of 845 shattered the illusion of invincibility. Paris had been bought, broken, and spared, every tax levied, every sword blessed, every wall built afterward carried the shadow of that day. Ragnar's attack was more than a raid. It was a revelation. He had proven that even the mightiest city could fall before a single man armed with fire, iron, and audacity. And from that moment on, the world would never forget. Every step a pilgrim took in the Middle Ages meant coins changing hands. Inns, taverns, blacksmiths, relic vendors, and even beggars depended on the steady stream of travelers seeking salvation. When hundreds or even thousands of pilgrims passed through a town each year, local economies didn't just survive, they flourished. Soon, entire pilgrim traps appeared, small villages suddenly blessed with miraculous visions, healing springs, or goats born with holy symbols on their sides. Within days, chapels were built, candles lit, and someone was charging a few coins for a glimpse at a finger bone allegedly belonging to Saint someone or other. Pilgrims arrived, merchants followed, and the church, after taking its cut, offered its blessing. The great pilgrimage sites, like Santiago de Compostela, became booming industries. Cloak weavers, cobblers, and bakers thrived on the constant flow of dusty travelers. Pilgrim guides offered protection, for a price, though some were little more than well-dressed bandits. Souvenir sellers hawked tin badges shaped like relics, worn proudly by pilgrims as proof of their journey, or bought by cheats who preferred to skip the road entirely. Even monasteries joined in, far from being purely spiri. Tool havens, many operated like medieval hotels, offering food and beds in exchange for donations. Some were generous, others mastered the art of holy overpricing. And where there was profit, there were scams, forged relics, fake monks, and staged miracles designed to part the faithful from their silver. Yet pilgrims knew the risks and often played along, believing that a few coins were a small price to pay for eternal salvation. The road to heaven, it seemed, was paved with silver. Thibri. Despite the hardship, very few pilgrims walked alone. Safety in numbers became the rule, and groups formed naturally. Villagers, merchants, monks, or strangers drawn together by the same destination and the same sore feet. Traveling together was messy but human. One day you might share your last crust of bread, the next you'd be arguing over a stolen turnip. Pilgrims came from every background: nobles, peasants, widows, and even criminals seeking penance, creating a chaotic mix of languages, tempers, and SMLs. Misunderstandings were constant, fights inevitable, but so were friendships. In the mud and misery, camaraderie bloomed. They laughed together, prayed together, carried one another when sickness struck, and mourned when someone didn't make it. Around smoky campfires they traded stories, sang, and shared small acts of kindness. For many, these fleeting bonds were the most sacred part of the journey. On the pilgrim road, people came and went like clouds, but the road always carried them forward. Of course, not everyone walked for holy reasons. Some pilgrims were sincere, seeking redemption or healing. Others treated the journey like a stage. These were the bragging pilgrims, eager to announce their suffering to anyone who would listen. Then there were the fashion pilgrims, wealthy nobles dressed in deliberately humble but lavish outfits, complete with servants to carry their luggage and feather mattresses. Others cheated outright, paying for rides, skipping parts of the journey, or simply buying badges in the market to fake their devotion. The church condemned these false pilgrims, and some towns even posted guards to verify papers, but enforcement was rare. As long as you donated generously, few asked questions. Yet, among the frauds and peacocks, genuine piety still shone. Many walked barefoot, fasted, or even carried crosses as penance. For them, the pain was the prayer. Pilgrimage wasn't about perfection, it was about showing up, limping and blistered and walking anyway. When the journey ended, the return home was rarely as glorious as imagined. Many pilgrims came back battered, broke, and scarred, physically and spiritually. Their feet were ruined, their backs bent, and their faith sometimes shaken. Villages expected them to be holier, wiser, glowing with divine peace. Instead, they often returned hungry, exhausted, and more interested in ale than absolution. Some were disillusioned, realizing that their prayers had gone unanswered. But others came back, transformed, not by relics, but by the road itself. They had seen the world, met strangers, and learned endurance, patience, and humility. Their souvenirs were blisters and perspective. A scallop shell from Santiago or a scrap of cloth from Jerusalem became badges of pride, proof that they had dared the road and survived it. Even the cheaters found meaning in the attempt. In the end, walking the road, no matter how imperfectly, was its own form of faith. Over time, pilgrimage reshaped medieval Europe. Routes like the Camino de Santiago, the Via Francigena, and the road to Canterbury became arteries of culture and commerce. Pilgrims stitched the continent together, crossing borders, trading languages, and sharing stories. Villages turned into towns, roads improved, and hostels, hospitals, and markets sprang up along the way. Spiritually, pilgrimage made faith physical. You could walk toward salvation, suffer for it, earn it step by step. It also left a lasting metaphor. Life as a road, holy. Ness as movement. Today, the same trails are still walked by hikers, seekers, and souls in search of peace. The prayers may have changed, the shoes are better, but the longing is the same. Because pilgrimage was never truly about reaching a shrine. It was about becoming someone new along the way. And perhaps that was the real relic, not a saint's bone locked in gold, but the pilgrim who returned home, still broken, still human, but walking anyway. In the world of medieval tournaments, looking good wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Before any lance was lowered or sword drawn, the spectacle began with the grand procession, a slow-moving parade of pride, armor, and ego that made royal coronations seem modest. Knights rode single file, banners fluttering, horses draped in vibrant caparisons, while squires scurried behind like anxious assistants. Heralds announced each contender's name, often adding dramatic flair. Victor of 3 past tournaments, or he who split a man's helmet clean in Hal. Humility had no place here. Ladies of the court, seated in silk-draped stands, judged the knights as if casting for a play, while noble lords analyzed potential allies or rivals. Among the cheering peasants, bets flew freely. Would Sir Geoffrey unhorse that smug Italian again? Would someone tumble during the opening bow? Half the excitement was in not knowing. Aye, brr. After the pageantry came the oaths. Each knight stepped forward before a judge, usually a high noble or even a king, and swore to uphold the code of chivalry. No striking a man without his helmet, no attacks from behind, and certainly no stabbing once your opponent was down. In other words, the bare minimum of decency. These promises, though public and sacred, weren't always followed to the letter. Some knights mentally added their own amendments. I vow not to trample anyone unless they insult my horse. Tournaments often added flair to the ceremony. Knights might dedicate their performance to a lady's honor, a saint's blessing. Or a personal vow of valor. Romantic, yes. Reckless, absolutely. But it turned warriors into characters and the lists into living stories, a mix of theater, faith, and violence draped in glory. When the trumpets finally blared, the crowd hushed. 2 knights faced each other across the tilt yard, separated by a wooden barrier called the tilt. This was the joust, the crown jewel of the tournament. Armored like walking fortresses, they lowered their visors, steadied their lances, and charged at full gallop. The goal, strike cleanly against shield, chest, or helmet. A shattering lance meant applause, and points unhorsing your opponent was pure triumph. But glory came with danger. Blunted lances still hit like freight trains. Broken ribs, shattered teeth, and dented helmets were common. One knight famously died when a splinter pierced his visor, an accident that forced stricter armor rules. Still, they returned for more. Victory meant fame, patronage, and admiration, even a single spectacula. Our tilt could earn a landless knight a noble sponsor, or at least a song in his honor. Because in truth, jousting wasn't just combat, it was performance. Precision, control, and showmanship mattered as much as brute force. And if the joust was a duel of finesse, the melee was a medieval free-for-all, a chaotic team-based brawl with swords, maces, and a surprising amount of enthusiasm. Dozens of knights charged each other across muddy fields, sometimes with goals like capturing a banner or rescuing a symbolic lady, but often just to survive the chaos. The rules existed, though mostly as suggestions. Try not to kill anyone was more of a polite request. Squires dashed in and out, replacing weapons or dragging their battered masters from the mud. It was violent, exhausting, and undeniably thrilling. For the spectators, it was a spectacle of organized chaos. For landless knights, it was opportunity. Winning a melee could earn riches or renown. Losing earned bruises and maybe a limp. But airy clash of steel reinforced the same idea. Valor wasn't quiet. It had to be seen. Of course, tournaments weren't just about blood and honor. They were about love, too. Knights performed not only for fame, but for the gaze of noblewomen. Ladies didn't simply watch, they participated. Many knights tied a lady's scarf or ribbon to their lance as a token of devotion. If he triumphed, she shared the glory. If he fell, well, she hadn't promised exclusivity. Women awarded prizes, crowns, rings, or a kiss, to victors, blending romance with rivalry. The tournaments became social theaters where glances were weapons and flirtation was strategy. Affairs blossomed, notes were exchanged, reputations rose and fell. The church condemned it all as sinful distraction, but no one cared. The poets certainly didn't. Minstrels and troubadours turned every victory and humiliation into song. A knight could win immortality or ridicule in verse, and in a world obsessed with honor, a lady's favor could matter more than a king's blessing. Yet beneath all the glamour lurked scandal and deceit. Some knights secretly reinforced their lances with metal or tampered with their armor to gain unfair advantages. Others bribed marshals to overlook foul play. Rivalries turned personal, duels erupted after dark, and drunken brawls were routine. There were even cases of imposters and disguised women competing, and occasionally winning, before being discovered. Injuries, both accidental and deliberate, were constant. Still, the audience loved it. Nobles craved the politics, peasants the chaos, and knights the fame. The clergy's warnings fell on deaf ears. Tournaments were too thrilling to abandon. By the late Middle Ages, tournaments had evolved from brutal training exercises into theatrical spectacles, a blend of sport, ceremony, and diplomacy. Armor grew ornate, weapons symbolic, and the fighting more choreographed than chaotic. Kings and queens hosted tournaments to impress allies and flaunt wealth. Henry VII. I himself loved jousting, until a severe head injury ended his fun and, some say, changed his temper forever. Eventually, as gunpowder redefined warfare, the tournament's practical purpose vanished. Armor was useless against bullets, and no amount of chivalric flair could stop cannon fire. Yet the spirit of the tournament endured. Its imagery, knights in shining armor, ladies offering favors, the thunder of hooves, became the foundation of romantic legend and literature. From Arthurian tales to Shakespeare's plays, and even today's Renaissance fairs and fantasy worlds, echoes of that pageantry remain. The medieval tournament wasn't just about combat, it was about performance, power, and passion, a place where honor was tested, reputations forged, and legends born in a storm of dust, splinters, and applause.